to cover a little bit of more fungi stuff. I wore my fungi sweatshirt. So, and the earrings. So both my classes, I'm talking about fungi again today. So it's like, I'm going big. I'm gonna go big or go home. So, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about this and then I'm going to go over the exam. So if you have your laptops, we can open it into EduCat and you'll be able to go over the exam. And so traditionally, historically, this exam is always the lowest of the four. And then students tend to bounce back and do better on the third and fourth. So don't panic. Plus, I still have to do stats. I know that there will be some point adjustments, which means your scores go up. You can't go down, they're gonna go up. And so I know that's gonna happen. I just haven't, I got so much committee work I'm just slammed with that right now. So I gotta get that done first, but then I can more carefully go through the stats for each question, and that takes a little bit of time. So, and then of course you can come see and we can go through things and strategize for getting better outcomes on the next one. So, all right. So with mycorrhizal fungi, we're looking at this idea that a very close symbiotic association with the plants. And this is taken from the front cover of a book where they're showing a conifer seedling and on several of them actually. And then basically you can see like the thicker yellowish, those are the roots, yellow, white. And then most of what you're seeing, that kind of whitish, more skinny look to it, that's the fungal hyphae. So they grew this seedling against some plexiglass so that you could see the development of the roots and then the mycorrhizal fungi. You can really see a burst of growth here with the mycorrhizal fungi. And so this has been of interest to scientists for decades because they understood that this relationship really benefits the plants. And so we're going to look at some of these mycorrhizal relationships, not all, but basically they're listing out some different types of mycorrhizal fungi on that left column. And you can see the number of plant species, and it is, you know, they usually say, depending on the expert talking, they'll say 80 to 90% of the higher plants have this relationship. So it's extensive. And so when they found out that it's that extensive, of course, they want to know, okay, obviously it must be very beneficial. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so extensive amongst all these different plant species forming this relationship. So what's going on here? So I'm going to be covering the top two here, the arbuscular mycorrhizae and the ecto, but there are other types, the orchid ones. You can't even get orchid seeds to germinate unless they have their mycorrhizal partner. It's that close of an association. So it's amazing that orchids, that plant group is one of the largest plant groups of all the flowering plants. And it's kind of amazing that that's the case when if you don't have the right mycorrhizal partner nearby, wherever that seed lands, you're toast, you're not going to make it. So very interesting dynamic there. All right, so let's look a little bit at this group, the ectomycorrhizal fungi, a big mouthful. Ecto means surface, and myco is referring to the fungus. And then anytime you see RRHIZA or ZO, rhiza, that means something root or root-like. And so ectomycorrhizal fungi, what they're trying to say is that these fungi form a pretty thick growth on the surface of the root, noticeable with the naked eye. Once you train your eye to it, you can see it. And so that's why they got that name. But I'll show you some pictures of what it actually looks like. These are the types of fungi that hang out around here. So all of our trees around here, a lot of our shrubs will have this relationship with these fungi. And you, of course, don't notice it because it's in the roots, in the soil, so you don't see it. The only time you really see the presence of the ectomycorrhizal fungi is if a tree overturns and the roots are exposed, and then you can actually see them. Or if you see the fruiting bodies pop up, the mushrooms. A lot of the mushrooms that we see by trees in the forests, they're ectomycorrhizal fungi. And many of them are edible. So with ectomycorrhizal fungi, you can see the flowering plants, the angiosperms and the gymnosperms, the conifers. They can form this relationship with these types of fungi. And you can have mixtures. So you can have many different species of the fungus hanging out with the same tree. You can have a mixed community. Some tropical trees will also have ectomycorrhizal fungi, but tropical trees tend to form a relationship with another group, the endomycorrhizal or the arbuscular, that I'll talk about in a little bit here. So this fungus you can see with the naked eye. So what you're seeing on that top image is a section of the roots that have been cleaned off. So the dark brown are the roots. And then you see that lighter brown, that's the mycorrhizal fungi. And so when they grow, when these type of fungi are growing through the soil, they grow in a form, we call them hyphae. So the hyphae are the long filamentous growth form. And if you look at that, if you've noticed it on your bread or on an orange, all that fuzzy fungal colony stuff, that's hyphae. That's a bunch of hyphae. And so it's just a very long filamentous growth. You can see it here very nicely. So these are more sparse hyphae. And then when you actually look at this compact growth, this is all hyphae too. It's just very compacted like a tissue. And so when you eat, mushrooms on your pizza, you're eating hyphae. It's just very compacted into a tissue-like organization. And so this is why they call them ectomycorrhizal fungi, because they form this tissue-like growth. It's all hyphae, but it's so packed and so dense that it really covers up the root nicely. And you can see it with the naked eye, because all of a sudden you'll see this plump, pumping out, the root will be skinny, and all of a sudden you'll see this fat pushing like this. And it's often a different color than the roots as well. And so that's a nice tip off. So they clean this off quite a bit, but you have to imagine, the reason I put this lower picture, in reality, when the roots are in the soil and the mycorrhizal fungi are hanging out with the roots, not only are they covering the roots very densely like that, but they're also sending out all the hyphae out into the soil. So that's going back to the first image I showed you. Where'd it go? So you have to imagine so this is like more of a tissue-like organization, really compact, and then you see it's sending out the hyphae. And so that's very beneficial to the plant. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail. And so the other idea here, I guess I did show it here. If you very, very carefully dig up some of the area around the roots, you often can see the hyphae growing out into the soil like that. And so, I've had some people go, oh no, a pathogen's attacking my plant. And it's like, no, that's probably a good fungus, especially if you see the above ground portion is looking just fine. This lower right image is what you would see with the naked eye. So this is blown up quite a bit under a dissecting scope. This is what you would see with the naked eye. Okay, so this is no magnification. And if you look, you can see the finer roots that are branching off. They look thicker and a little bit darker than this long root that you see. And so those are mycorrhizal fungi that are growing on the root.
Question for the top right picture, is that on soil?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I always thought that was spider webs.
Oh, yeah, it does look that way, doesn't it? No, it's mycorrhizal fungi. So,
That's good.
yeah, so they're good guys. And, well, spiders are good too. I like spiders. So, but anyways, you can see, with the naked eye, you train your eye to it. When I was out hiking with my boys, they would get irritated with me because I'd see a turned over tree. I'm like, my nose is practically in the roots. I'm like, let's look for the fungi. And they're like, oh. So, yeah. And so, yeah, they had to put up with that. So this is under a dissecting scope again, but I chose this just to show that the fungi have different pigments, sometimes very dramatic, so you can easily pick them out. And then, this one, they didn't completely wash off, so you can see some of the hyphae still still growing off the root. But there's different types of fungi, different species, different pigments. And so this, it just depends what species of plant you're looking at. So we tend to see like a successional pattern of fungi. If you take a tree, a seedling, let's say a seedling from, the nursery in the greenhouse, and you outplant it, and then you follow what types of fungi start to hang out with that seedling, you see a succession, just like if you've learned in intro ecology, you tend to see a succession of plants and trees in a forest ecosystem. You tend to see that underground too, where you'll get some of the mycorrhizal fungi, they come in first, they're the early or primary colonizers, and then other fungi will gain a foothold and maybe the first one dies off or goes away a little bit. And so you do have a lot of dynamic that way. It's not just like one fungus to this tree forever and ever.
Can the good fungus like outbully the bad fungus?
Yes, and so mycorrhizal fungi can be, that's one of the reasons why I got very interested in mycorrhizal fungi, because I wanted to find both fungi and bacteria that hang out with plants that can help the plant fight against pathogens. And so I worked with two specific species of ectomycorrhizal fungi for my PhD that both had that ability to show inhibitory patterns against pathogens. And so very, very, this is still a really hot field of research because they understand how important the fungus is for the plant and the overall health of the plant. And so if you look at some of those roots in cross section, what this artist has done is trying to show that really thick hyphal growth around on the surface of the root. But that's not all. It doesn't end there. We also see with the ectomycorrhizal fungi is that they start to grow in between the root cells. So all of this is supposed to be showing the hyphae growing in the cell wall space. So they kind of hug around all the cells in the roots that they're colonizing. And that just allows for a more intimate physical interaction so that they can exchange nutrients with each other. And so the ectomycorrhizal got their name because they form such a thick. I think I have this word somewhere, but let me just write it. Mantle is the fancy word for that very thick growth around the root. We call it a fungal mantle. And so they have that very thick mantle, but then they also grow in between the cells. If you look at a root in longitudinal section, this is very common, not 100%, but it's very common that when a root gets colonized by ectomycorrhizal fungi, the root changes its morphology. Instead of having just straight roots, some of the smaller roots like this, they're supposed to be normally straight. They'll actually divide into like a Y pattern. It looks like the letter Y. And that's some kind of communication going on between the fungus and the root. And they think that the plant does that just to increase the surface area so that the fungus can colonize better and have better exchange of nutrients. And so that's a dead giveaway. If you ever see roots and the smaller roots are in that Y shape, you know that there's mycorrhizal fungi that have interacted with that root and probably are colonizing that root. So that's another thing that you look for. And I think, well, I have some pictures in a minute here that shows that a little bit better. So here, this is like one of the earlier studies that they did where you have plants grown with and without the presence of mycorrhizal fungi, and you can see a huge difference. So this is all well colonized by ectomycorrhizal fungi. This is not. And you can see a massive difference in biomass. The biomass can be very extensive with the ectomycorrhizal fungi. They're very luxuriant in their growth. Here's another image here. Without is on the top. No ectomycorrhizal fungi at the top. And then here you can see that nice Y pattern on several of these. So again, you can see the Y pattern on many of these images on the right. It's not 100%, like these are still colonized too, but you don't see the Y pattern. So it's not 100%, but that's a dead giveaway if you see that. So when you see the fungus growing, the ectomycorrhizal fungus growing, you'd have to do this under the microscope. You'd have to take a section and probably do a little bit of staining. But again, this is trying to show the hyphal growth in between all the root cells. And so they call that type of growth the Hartig net, named after Dr. Hartig. So I would like you to know that. So when someone says, oh, wow, look at that Hartig net, what they're trying to just, point to is all this hyphal growth in between the cells. Here's another image showing that very thick mantle growth, very dense and tissue-like. And then all the blue in between the cells is the Hartig net. And so you can imagine that creates a lot of surface area for exchange of chemicals and nutrients. So we'll talk more about that. Yes.
Is like the mantle, like more specific, just like the ectomycorrhizal fungi? Okay.
Yep. Yep, and then we're gonna compare this group to the, I often call them the endomycorrhizal fungi. Those are the arbuscular type. They have to keep throwing jargon at us. They keep renaming things. It's like, would you stick with something? But anyways, so if you're out hiking around and you see a fruiting body by a tree, whether it's conifer tree or a flowering tree, an angiosperm, that's most likely an ectomycorrhizal fungus that you are seeing the above ground portion. So when fungi decide to form a fruiting body, that's their version of kicking into sexual reproduction. And so, otherwise you don't see them, but every time you're out hiking around, underneath your feet are miles and miles or kilometers and kilometers of mycorrhizal fungi.
I was just about to ask, for the fungi.
Yeah.
It can like start in one place and like go outwards with like many different connections, right? So isn't it just one big mushroom fungi thing?
Yep. Yeah, the humongous fungus is actually that idea. My PhD, one of my committee members, Johan Brun, he worked in the forestry department at Michigan Tech, and he and his colleague from Canada broke that story. They discovered that, and it was hilarious. So I was a grad student when the humongous fungus hit the news. And so all the news people like CNN and, Fox News, they were all like, we want to come see your humongous fungus. And so they were expecting a huge mushroom, like this massive, redwood sized mushroom or something. And yeah. And so he was kind of a easily irritated person. And so he got upset after a while. He's like, I can't take this anymore. So he took them out tromping, and he took them in a deliberately difficult terrain with their cameras. And then he took them, for like, I don't know, well over a mile of hiking difficult terrain. And then he says, okay, we're here. And they're like, well, where is it? And he's like, you're standing on it, and they did not like that. But he got a hoot. He was regaling me about that story. He thought it was pretty funny. So yeah, so he just got so sick of it. So yeah, but you are walking on mycorrhizal fungi, even out here, you are.
How do they come to terms about like how length and the depth, like how are they able to?
They did a ton of sampling over acres of this terrain, and then they did genetic testing. And they figured out it was all a clone. It was all clonal tissue, which means it's one big organism. And so all that fungal hyphae belonged to one fungus. So the humongous fungus.
There's one in Oregon, but it's like 3 clones, so they're cheating.
Oh, yeah, Mary.
So is that why they say for finding around mushrooms, so specific? I forgot what type of tree.
Yes, yeah. They tend to favor interactions with certain trees. Well, there's definitely chemical communication going on. And when I was doing my PhD, my one committee member was a molecular biologist, Dr. Padilla. And he and I were looking at gene expression patterns once they first, like before and after, what's going on. And so we were very interested in that idea. What's the chemical communication going on here? And there's, I don't know if they would classify it as quorum sensing per se, but there's definitely different fungi have different chemicals, and then the tree will have certain chemicals. So it could be that kind of specificity for like the morel idea, that it only can talk to certain trees and form the relationship with certain trees. So, yes.
I was gonna ask, where it like originated from, like, did it originate from like a tree, like through the immune system and then spread wide, or was it just a given? fungi?
So there's fungi in, around plants all the time, and many are not mycorrhizal, but this relationship is something that's been going on since the transition from ocean into terrestrial land. So going back in the evolutionary process of how land plants became land plants, they're now hypothesizing that the only way that happened at that point in time was the mycorrhizal fungi were on land, because they can even show, so I'm jumping ahead into the class, but green algae were the ancestor to terrestrial plants. In the green algae chromosome, there's genes for the mycorrhizal relationship, even though they were in the ocean and didn't form relationships, but they had the genes necessary. So when they came on shore, the fungi were there, they formed a relationship. So they think that there was mycorrhizal fungi right there from the get-go. And so this has been a million years, millions and millions of years of interaction over time. And it's just so widespread. So they attribute the mycorrhizal fungi for the success of the plant to be able to make if you think about it, going from an aquatic, salty environment to a very dry terrestrial soil environment, that is a tremendous shift. I mean, it's amazing that you can get any successful shift, but they say the mycorrhizal fungi helped with that.
Yeah, because yeast plays a part in it as well, correct?
We'll talk about lichens. There's yeast involved in lichen formation.
So I'm sorry.
Yeah, we'll talk about that too. So ectomycorrhizal fungi are the one type. So Lacaria bicolor, by the way, is one of the ectomycorrhizal fungi that I worked with. There was, at that time when I was in grad school, there was a couple of scientists, especially a group out over in France that Dr. Padilla worked with, where they were doing a lot of DNA sequencing of the fungus. So this was the first fungus to be sequenced. Mycorrhizal fungus to be sequenced. And so that's one reason why I picked this, because there's a lot of active work on it already with several different groups around the world of scientists. But also Lacaria bicolor does have biocontrol abilities. And it's pretty easy to grow in the lab. So that was nice too. So let's contrast that now with this group, the endomycorrhizal fungi, also called vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, or just arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, several names. I tend to say endo for this purpose, endomycorrhizal fungi, but you'll see a lot of, and now it used to be vesicular arbuscular, and mycorrhizal, which you can abbreviate down to VAM, you just say VAM, but now they've taken the V off, and to me, AM, that doesn't sound right. It's like teaching, saying AM, and you're like, what are you talking about? So I don't do that. So that's why I tend to say endo, because it's short and to the point and distinctive. But anyway, so now we're looking at a bunch of endomycorrhizal fungi under the microscope. So what we're seeing with this group is that they will not form a big mantle of growth on the surface. So what this artist is trying to show is there is growth on the surface, but it's very sparse, not that thick mantle. They don't have that, but they can still grow into the root tissue, and they can grow a little bit more intimately in the root tissue compared to the ectos. But let's go back to this. So with the endo, let me show you at least the basic here. More plants can hang out with endos, or more endos hang out with plants. Let's put it that way, I guess. Compared to the ectomycorrhizal fungi. Ectos are a little bit more limited to who they can hang out with. Endos have a much broader host options. of what plants they'll hang out with. And so many, and this 80%, some people say 90% form the endo relationship. So most of the herbaceous plants that you see, pea plants, tomatoes, corn, a lot of eggplants will have this relationship. Your, wildflowers in your yard, the grasses in your yard. So lots and lots of plants have the endo fungi hanging out with them. There are some trees, especially tropical trees, will have some of the endos hanging out. And one tree can have endomycorrhizal fungi hanging out with them and ecto. And so they can form a relationship with both. So they are definitely more widespread. Unfortunately, they're not easy to find visually. They are not easy to spot on the roots, for example, because they don't form that nice thick mantle. But they do form a more intimate association inside the root tissue. Now, this is maybe what you saw. Did you look at the mycorrhizal fungi in lab yesterday, some prepared slides? So you might have seen this. This is one of them. And so here, this kind of is confusing because you see all the red fungal hyphae. And if I said, where are they? You would probably say, well, they're in the cells, which I totally get why you say that, because that's what it looks like. But this is just under a light microscope and you can't see the details of what's going on here. So let me make the hard point that they don't swim around in the cytoplasm. All right, the fungal hyphae is not that intimate with the root cells. And so if they did penetrate into the cytoplasm and were actually in physical contact with the cytoplasm, it tends to set off a defense response by the plant. The plant is like, ooh, you breached my boundary. You were probably a pathogen. I'm going to fight you. All right. And so they also find under very careful electron microscope work that, so here, if you look at it, you're like, well, yeah, it's in the cell, but technically what's going on here is that you have the, all this green here, that's the plant membrane that is surrounding the fungal hyphae. So even though it looks like the fungus is in the cell, it's not technically making contact with the cytoplasm.
They between the cell wall and the membrane.
So here you have the plant membrane, and it's probably cell membrane material that's elongated and covered, is creating a barrier against the fungal hyphae getting direct physical contact. So I always say the fungi aren't swimming around in the cytoplasm. They're not free in the cytoplasm. They're always covered by plant-derived membrane.
But if this was the cell wall, this is the membrane, they're like in the.
So what I like to think of it is, so they can penetrate past the cell wall of the root cells. And then they kind of hug up against the cell membrane. They make, physical contact with the cell membrane of the root cell. And so now it's a really intimate association. You can imagine really nice transfer of chemicals in back and forth here. And so they're more intimate with the roots and root tissue, but they aren't free in the cells. Okay, and that's a big deal. That's a kind of a pet peeve I have. So I am going to ask you about this on the exam, because if you read the common literature, they make it sound like the fungal hyphae is just swimming around in the cytoplasm and having a ball. And it's like, no, that would trigger a defense response. They've done some really nice studies to show.
And this is only for the endo microarray?
Yes. And so the ectos don't even get past the cell wall. They just hang out in between the cell walls. Endos, they can break down carefully a section of the cell wall and then hug up to the membrane. And if they keep growing and kind of growing out into the cell, so to speak, they're always surrounded by the plant membrane. So when you look at it, it's very easy to think that they're just swimming around. And a lot of images make it look that way. A lot of people write it that way in the regular literature. So just be careful about that, because it's a big misperception. So again, going back to this, there's no heavy mantle of fungal growth, very light amount of growth on the surface, but more extensive inside. So that's why they're endomycorrhizal fungi. They're emphasizing the idea that they have more extensive growth. And then they do form, so the vesicular term came from the idea that the fungal hyphae can, at their tips, often they'll balloon out. Like they just form this balloon-like shape. And again, that's really good for increasing surface area, so you get really nice exchange of nutrients. Or they'll form, if you look up the word arbuscule, it means dwarf tree. And so but it's just fungal hyphae that's changed its morphology into these short little branches like this, but that's just all fungal hyphae. And that's where they got the term arbuscular, because it's, where is that image? I'll go back. Oh, here it is. This one. Let's go back to this one. So this is an arbuscule, singular, dwarf tree. Doesn't that look like a dwarf tree or a shrub? So, and then the vesicles are the bloom shape. So, but that's all fungal hyphae. It's just their trick to try to increase surface area. So, but again, it does look like they're in the cell, but they technically are surrounded by plant membrane the whole time. Okay, so no matter which type of mycorrhizal fungi you're looking at, definitely advantages to the plant to have this relationship. Not only did it help them get onto land successfully millions of years ago, but they've done so many studies that show clear improvement in uptake of minerals, including, and I've ranked them, phosphorus uptake is tremendously improved in the presence of the mycorrhizal fungi. Phosphorus is one of the toughest minerals for plants to get access to. It's just really hard. And the mycorrhizal fungi is like, no problem, I can do that for you. And so their increase in access to phosphorus is huge. And then nitrogen and potassium. Also, you can see big increases if you do side-by-side comparisons of with the fungus and without. Water uptake is tremendously improved with the presence of, if you think about all that fungal hyphae going out into the soil, and the idea that the fungal hyphae is very, very petite. Where we go back. Where is it? Go back to the fungal hyphae is much more narrow in diameter than even the finest roots. And so the fungal hyphae can get into cracks and crevices of the soil system that the roots just can't get to. And so you can get all that access to minerals and water that a normal root just can't physically get access to. Whoops, wrong one. Oh, that is the right one. Okay. So all of that will stimulate the seedling growth. It just really gives them a jump. And it certainly gives some protection. There's physical protection with that mantle. There's chemical protection because they can help protect the plant chemically against pathogens. And so you have those advantages as well. And then the fungus, it's like, well, okay, so the fungus is doing a lot for the plant. The plant is actually giving a lot of its sugars to the fungus. And so they've done some nice carbon dating or carbon tracking of once the plant does photosynthesis, makes their sugar. Some trees that they've done studies on give 30 to 40% of their sugars to the fungus. That's a lot. That's a huge commitment. And so the tree is obviously thinking, so to speak, and it's very advantageous to keep these fungi with them. And if they're going to feed them so luxuriantly like that. And so this is definitely, the fungus is getting a lot of sugars from the plant. So very, very interesting interaction. Here's just some, you can buy this Great White Company. You can buy endomycorrhizal fungi and add them into your soil if you want, if you grow crops or, grow your tomatoes in the summer or whatever. And so these are just some of the pictures that they show of the difference in how the plants thrive. So you have to imagine all these mycorrhizal fungi hanging out in the roots on the roots, in the root tissue, spreading their hyphae out into the soil. And no matter which way that soil is getting access to nutrients, the fungi, the presence of the fungi there is definitely helping the plant get access to minerals, to water. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this idea in a little bit, but I wanted to stop here, I think, for today. And let me open up the exam so we can go through that. So if you get to your EduCat and I'll have to get it set up and then you'll have to probably refresh.